Back in 2024, Professor Jian issued 3 daring predictions. First, he foresaw Donald Trump returning to office. Second, he anticipated that the United States would engage in a military conflict with Iran. And third, the most contentious of all, he claimed that the United States would ultimately fail in that war. With the first 2 developments already unfolding, Professor Jian continues to maintain confidence in his third forecast. In a recent interview, he elaborated on why he believes the U.S. faces inherent structural disadvantages in a protracted confrontation with Iran. Professor Jian emphasizes that this conflict should not be understood as a conventional military showdown. According to him, it is not a matter of rapid supremacy or sheer overwhelming firepower. Instead, he frames it as a war of attrition, a slow, grinding struggle in which endurance, cost-effectiveness, and patient strategy dictate the outcome. He argues that Iran has been meticulously preparing for precisely this kind of conflict for nearly 20 years. In his analysis, Iran's military doctrine, political ideology, and strategic planning are all designed with a potential clash against the United States in mind. Professor Jian suggests that Iran's leadership has long portrayed the U.S. as a persistent adversary, shaping how the nation prepares both psychologically and operationally for war. He believes that this extended period of preparation grants Iran a level of readiness that many outside observers fail to fully recognize. Professor Jian also referenced a 12-day conflict that occurred several months earlier, describing it as more than a minor skirmish. He contends that the brief engagement acted as a testing ground, allowing Iran to assess American and Israeli interception rates, air defense responses, and missile performance. In the months that followed, according to Jian, Iran did not remain idle. That period was used to refine tactics, adjust targeting, and prepare for escalation. A cornerstone of Professor Jian's argument is the principle of asymmetry. He asserts that Iran does not need to match U.S. technology on a one-to-one basis. Instead, it gains an advantage through cost disparities. He explains that when relatively inexpensive drones or missiles compel the United States to deploy highly costly interceptors, the financial burden accumulates over time. Even if interception success remains high, the economic equation gradually becomes unfavorable. Jian cites reports showing multiple interceptors neutralizing single threats as evidence that advanced defense systems, while sophisticated, may not be sustainable in a prolonged high-volume exchange. According to Professor Jian, modern warfare is increasingly defined by cost efficiency and saturation tactics rather than purely technological superiority. He observes that the U.S. military, structured during the Cold War, prioritizes expensive, advanced systems designed for deterrence and strategic projection on long-term asymmetric drone and missile engagements. This, he argues, exposes a significant vulnerability. Another key aspect of his analysis involves Iran's extensive proxy network. Jian notes that Iran's alliances with groups like Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, and other regional militias create a dispersed battlefield. This dispersion, he explains, forces the United States to defend multiple fronts simultaneously: naval routes, Gulf bases, regional partners, and critical energy infrastructure. The result, according to Jian, is that American forces cannot concentrate their power in a single decisive theater and must stretch resources across several strategic zones at once. Professor Jian also highlights energy infrastructure as a primary target. Beyond military installations, he emphasizes the strategic vulnerability of desalination plants, oil facilities, and energy pipelines in the Gulf. Disruption of these systems, he argues, could trigger immediate humanitarian and economic crises in countries highly dependent on them. He further explains that Gulf economies are tightly linked to the American financial system through oil exports and capital reinvestment. In his view, revenue from oil flowing back into U.S. markets sustains large-scale investment sectors, including technology and artificial intelligence development. Jian suggests that any destabilization of Gulf states or interruptions to oil exports could ripple across global financial systems. In this sense, parts of the American economy are structurally reliant on continued capital inflows from producing allies. On a broader geopolitical scale, Professor Jian portrays the current conflict as a potential turning point in global power dynamics. He argues that sustained strain on U.S. military resources and economic stability could accelerate the emergence of a multipolar world order. When asked about the use of ground troops, Jian noted that historically, regime change is rarely achieved through power alone. He believes that sustained political transformation often requires boots on the ground. However, he cautioned that sending ground forces into Iran would mark a dramatic escalation. Domestic political resistance to such a move remains substantial within the United States. Jian also posits that regional allies could sway American decisions. If Gulf states or Israel perceive a direct threat, they might pressure the U.S. toward a stronger intervention. He addressed reports suggesting Saudi Arabia may have encouraged escalation against Iran, explaining that the kingdom views Iran as a principal regional rival. Saudi efforts to diversify economically beyond oil, he contends, may heighten the urgency to counter Iranian influence. He emphasizes that these interpretations reflect his personal analysis of regional motivations. Regarding President Trump's strategic calculus, Jian proposed several possible explanations. He suggested that historical trends show major powers occasionally act from overconfidence following early military successes. Tactical victories, he notes, can foster a sense of invincibility that influences subsequent decision-making. He also considered potential political incentives in strategic calculations. These perspectives reflect his personal conclusions rather than mainstream geopolitical consensus. Later, Professor Jian introduced more speculative theories involving covert power structures and ideological motives. While these form part of his broader worldview, he acknowledged they are not widely supported by established geopolitical analysts. What remains central in Jian's framework is his structural thesis. The United States faces three simultaneous pressures in this conflict. First, cost asymmetry in munitions and air defense. Second, geographic dispersion imposed by Iran's proxy network. Third, economic vulnerability linked to Gulf stability and oil flow. Jian asserts that if the conflict becomes prolonged rather than decisive, these pressures compound over time. Yet, whether his prediction is ultimately accurate depends on multiple variables: U.S. production capacity for interceptors, Gulf resilience under infrastructure strain, Iran's economic endurance under sanctions, potential diplomatic solutions, and the involvement of other global powers. His forecast of U.S. defeat is grounded in the assumption that the war extends and becomes financially draining rather than brief and decisive. He emphasizes that in wars of attrition, sustainability often outweighs initial firepower. The ultimate accuracy of this assessment remains uncertain. What is clear, however, is that Professor Jian's analysis centers on logistics, economic structures, and strategic patience rather than battlefield spectacle. He challenges the notion that technological superiority alone guarantees victory. As events progress, the question is no longer only who wins the next strike, but who can sustain pressure longer economically, militarily, and politically. Professor Jian's prediction is audacious. His reasoning emphasizes structural economics and asymmetric warfare. Yet, like all forecasts, it relies on assumptions about duration, escalation, and political will. Only time will reveal whether his third prediction comes to fruition, or if the strategic balance shifts in unforeseen ways.